Welcome back, guys. So last week, just to review, we went from our shape drawing or a line drawing and we turned it into shape with value. So we looked at the light of the paper as the light value, and then we went for a 3.5 to 4 value for the shadow pattern. In effect, giving us a 2-value pattern drawing, which we called known. And what it does and what it's great for is, and you might remember this from class, is that it actually provides us a more accurate way to check our proportions, right? So now instead of just having a line drawing on there, we've got some big light and dark, light and shadow patterns to look at. And it makes the proportions really stand out. So before I get too far into drawing, I like to do that. Not looking at any of the halftones or any of the deep darks, but just putting down this general light and dark. And I'm noticing that once I did that, it became very apparent to me that this brush container or brush holder has gotten too wide and actually too long too. So I'm going to go ahead and correct that. It shouldn't be too hard to correct because I haven't got into any of my shading or halftones yet, so there's not too much I have to change. I have to maybe move in this contour line right here and then adjust the bottom part. So this is a great time to do that, and it's never too late, especially in pencil, and even more in paint, where you can just go in and paint over something or wipe it out. We want to correct that. So if the goal is to capture an accurate proportion or representation of reality, then we don't ever want to say, good enough, right? We can push it a little bit further and correct it. We never want to have a drawing or painting that's too precious that we don't go in and fix. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Okay, so I did clean that up as best I could. You could see it wasn't too hard to move the contour in and move the bottom up, and then just filling in what was light down here with a little bit of that local tone we talked about last week. Then these shapes, the dark shape of the color of the book against the light shape of the brush holder, they feel a little bit more accurate now to me. And then I had to readjust the width of the ellipse up here and here, which was a little bit hard, I think, working around the camera for me. But what I was aiming there to do was build it around that symmetry axis we talked about in the very first week, or maybe the second week when we constructed this. Thinking that it has to be symmetrical along this axis. So anything going down this way has to bend towards us in either direction. Same thing for this lower lip. The bottom of the ellipse on our page is going to be the front part of that cup, and everything has to bend away from us back into the page, or up on the page, creating that depth of space. So just trying to keep it symmetrical at the same time, all around that axis. Other things, I was just taking another look at my setup, and this can get a little bit wider. I think that cast shadow back there. Same thing with this guy, kind of gets a little diffused, but wider in general. And then there's a little bit I forgot to put in this cast shadow over here, where the light source was this. Remember, we indicate right there, coming, and we get the cast shadow of the skull over here, which could be an important kind of balancing piece too, of that known light and dark. So I'm just going to put that in, and then we'll get into what we're going to cover this week. But I do think that's important, always correcting, especially in these early stages. We want to start with a strong foundation, so it's a lot easier to correct it now than later. And then we'll get into what we're going to cover this week, which is taking those light and shadow a little bit further, revisiting that third quality of drawing, which is the edge quality. And then the deeper part of the shadows are going to be our occlusion shadows for our casts, and the core shadows in the form. So we'll cover that once I add in that cast shadow. Let's revisit our stuff from last week, what we covered. We moved from shape into value, found our light shape, found our shadow shapes, and then we applied in a very simple way our edge quality that applied to all the different shadow types. Okay, so we had 2 shadow types, the shadows on the forms. So we have like a, last week we used a cylinder, but if we have something more spherical, more egg-like. The shadow type's on the form, and then the second type of shadow type is the cast shadow that's cast by the form. And just really briefly, we looked at how most form shadows, if it's a very rounded form, are going to be soft, right? Because if the light hits here, the highlight, and then we roll through all these half tones, it's rolling around this volume, and gradually it can't reach, and it can't reach, and it kind of gets very soft gradation into there. Versus the form of this egg is casting and blocking out completely all the light. And it only gets softer as light bouncing off the wall, bouncing off the page, bounce back into this shadow and diffuses that edge. And then it gives us this reflected light right here. So we're gonna actually talk about this reflected light. We're gonna talk about this core shadow, and we're gonna talk about this occlusion shadow. So those are the two simplest shadows, are the shadow on the form and the shadow cast by the form and cast. But then each of those have those secondary ones we just talked about. In the form, there's generally that band which cuts right at the point where the light can't get around any further. So it's trailing off, and then right there at that core, it can't go any further, and it juts down, shoots down. So the wavelengths of the light go boom, 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 and then shoot down to right there. And then they start to bounce back into here, giving reflected light. So right at that point of no return is the core shadow. And that is part of the form. It's in the form shadow. And then down here in the cast shadow, so the cast shadow is cast by the form, we have that light that's bouncing back in here and creating that reflected light, and also diffusing this edge. It's bouncing all around. Where it can't reach, where no light is either trailing around the form and then shooting off, creating this cast shadow, bouncing back in, creating reflected light. Where that can't reach, where no light is actually getting, it's a little bit hard to see from here, so I'm going to move the camera down. And actually, let's illustrate this egg. Okay, so I'm going to put a picture up of the egg on the screen. So remember, establish your light source. So my appear is going to be coming down. We get this highlight right here on the egg, and then, as I was saying, the light is kind of wrapping around. Think of it kind of as water spilling over the form. And we can, when we squint down with our eyes, just squint, 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 we get that nice separation of light and dark. And then even on the ground plane and the light paper tone, we get a nice sharp kind of delineation of light here. So we have light, shadow, shadow, light. We could go ahead and tone this just like our drawing. So we have form shadow, cast shadow. And last week I said we get these places of lost edges in here, and that's completely okay because we're looking for the big shapes. We're trying to move away from line. But then I also said don't be afraid, because we will find a lot of that information back again. And trust in kind of the proportional drawing skills that we've been building all semester, that you'll be able to find it again. So it's all right to lose it, and then we can look at these minor parts of the shadows, which I mentioned. We have the core shadow in the form, and we have the occlusion shadow in the cast. And so that's going to be this soft core on the form. And it's going to be this, that's on the form, and in the cast we have the occlusion. And remember, that's where no light is actually reaching. So we have light spilling over, shooting down, creating this sharper edged cast shadow, and then bouncing all which way and flooding back in and hitting back in here, creating a nice reflected light area. And then filling this cast shadow a little bit, especially from this edge over, getting another gradation in there. But where it's not going is down here in the occlusion. So that's usually, in reference to the 5 scale, that's going to be your darkest spot. So say we've got, you know, maybe white of the paper for the highlight, and then we have maybe value 2 for the halftones, going into that 3.5 for the shadow shape we toned in. Then we can go back and maybe put like a 4 here for your form. And then your 5, deepest dark down here for your occlusion. Or also sometimes called, when referencing like an object like this on a table, a contact shadow. It's where it's contacting the surface it's sitting on. Occlusion, I refer to occlusion just because you get the same thing to like on the forms of the body or anything where you're not actually like have contact with something, but like down in here, the deep darks, same thing is happening. It's just the light is occluded from there, so it's super deep and dark. And just like we have these lost edges in shadow, where the values kind of match up, we also have that happening in the lights too, where maybe the light of the page equals the same value as the light of the light shape on the object. So really utilizing those lost edges creates a more believable sense of reality compared to just outlining the whole thing. Outlining definitely creates a clearer like communication of what you're trying to get across. So when we get to like illustration of products and stuff, you do get more outlined objects just because it's quicker to get your idea across. But if we're going for an illusion of reality, then you want to be able to play around with that loss of line and lost edge quality. Oops. Okay, and this is a tan or brown egg, so it has a little bit more tone in there than just the white of the paper, and then you get to highlight just the white of the paper. Okay, so that's what we're going to be focusing on this week, is now that we've got our light and shadow, taking a look at our edge quality, so the edges of how the light and shadow meet. Is it going to be soft, like this core shadow? So we're going to be adding core shadows, looking at the softness rolling out. And you'll notice the core shadow isn't always constant. Like where you find the light and shadow on the form itself, it's not a constant band all the way around that. You want to look for where it gets darker, like this, and maybe a little bit less soft, and where it kind of gradates out and gets nice and soft. Look for that variation. In effect, we haven't pulled out anything to create the reflected light. We've just pushed the core shadow darker, giving us this relatively lighter value between the core shadow and occlusion shadow. What we don't want to do is something like an egg and then, you know, shadow like this, and then we go in and we erase out all of our reflected light. Because that's going to destroy the illusion of the form. When the shadow becomes as light as anything in the light shape, because now we're just using the same white of the paper as our reflected light and our light source, or our lit shapes on the object, then there's no value pattern or kind of control of the value or hierarchy of lights and darks. So that's why we do go through and tone everything 3.5. And then we create that illusion of that reflected light bouncing in there by pushing this a little bit darker, pushing the occlusion a little bit darker. And now relatively, that reflected light is getting a little bit lighter, but still staying within the shadow pattern, okay? So it's a simplified way of thinking, and you can see how I earlier prescribed kind of these values to 1 of the highlight, 2 of the halftone, 3.5 of the shadow, 4 of the core, and maybe 5 of the occlusion. It's not always that neat and tidy, but we have to find a balance between what we're observing up there and then kind of putting these two there, controlling it a little bit. So it's about organizing your value system, right? It's as much observation taking information from the setup you have at home and looking for the light and shadow, and then pushing the occlusion and forms. But you notice how I prescribed, highlight, halftone 2, value of the shadows 3.5, and then pushing the core to maybe a 4 and the occlusion to a 5. That's kind of cut and dry, very neat, and that's not always the case in your setup. So it's a balance between observing up there and then simplifying it and communicating it easily in kind of a simplified form, thinking about the light logic of how it hits and making it just easy for us to draw or paint or illustrate, and then for the observer to see and clearly grasp and understand what's going on. Okay, so we're going to apply, we're going to take the forms a little bit further by adding our core shadows where we see them, and then utilizing that soft edge of the form shadows, rolling it into the halftones. And then we're going to push the cast shadows by adding our occlusion shadows, or deep dark, so finding some of those lost edges we might have lost in the value toning part of the drawing from last week. So I'm going to go now, do what we just covered. It might be helpful for you to set up a simplified geometric object like an egg. White eggs work great out of the fridge in your controlled light source. You'll note what's kind of cool about this. So notice how simplified the shadow shape is on here. It's light and shadow. And then when you put it on a lighter object, you can see how it kicks back more light now, because the light's reflecting off the white of the paper, and you get much more strong reflected lights. But that same principle applies of nothing in your shadows can be as light as anything in your light. That'll muddy up your shadow patterns and having a controlled hierarchy of lights and darks on your page. So that's why we always squint and break it down into this known light shapes and shadow shapes. And then we just push our core shadow, which we just covered, our occlusion and cast shadows a little bit darker, and that's going to create that nice reflected light effect. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at our core shadows, our occlusion shadows on each one of our objects, and then how push those effects of the soft core shadow and form, and then the sharper cast shadow. And that'll about cover what we need to do this week. And then next week we'll get into like the nitty gritty of highlights and halftones, and that'll be a wrap. Okay, so I jumped around a little bit, but you can see I went in and I darkened up those contact shadows of each object. And then I darkened up the core shadows in the form shadows on the cylinder, places on the skull like here, here, here. Even the smaller ones that are a little bit harder to see along the nasal bone down through here. And then this would technically kind of be considered a core shadow as well. And then I did a little bit of unifying of kind of getting into the halftones of the darker, like the backdrop back here, just because I wanted to keep this more shape based than linear based. So I want to get rid of that outline. So the only way to do that is to pull the tone across and to make that light shape come out against that dark shape instead of just having it outlined. And then even I pushed the core shadows along here, and then some of the occlusion shadows and the details of the brushes. So that's what we would cover this week. Go through, and remember when we started, we just had light and dark. So push where the light meets the dark. Push your form shadows where we get a nice amount of volume. Where it becomes more gradated, you can pull a little bit of the halftones into the light shape. And then look at your contact shadows to make sure these sit nicely and firmly on whatever setup you have, tabletop you have. That's going to be the darkest darks, your value 5, because no light is actually getting in there. And then next week we'll dive back into the details, maybe go over the halftones and highlights, and then talk about choosing a focal point and really pushing that a little bit more contrasty, and then subduing the contrast throughout the rest of the piece to support that. All right, have a good week.